Hidden crime stories. The murder of Matthew Restelli. He parked carefully in the driveway, hazard lights on. His wife had put cardboard down on the ground so his truck wouldn't drip oil on the pavement near her mother's home. A small, considerate detail. The kind of thing you do when you're expecting someone, when you want things to look right before they arrive. Matthew Restelli walked up to the front door. He took off his sandals and stepped inside. He had driven hundreds of miles from his home in rural California, believing he was there to pick up his wife and their 2 young children and bring them all back home together. Within 60 seconds, he was shot 7 times. 3 of the bullets hit him in the back. He fell face down on the floor, roughly 10 to 15 feet from where he'd left his shoes. It took 8 minutes before anyone in that house called 911. The first call actually came from a neighbor across the duplex wall, 1 minute after the shots, after she had texted to ask if everything was okay. When police finally arrived, the man who had pulled the trigger spoke first. His words, "That guy had a knife." There was a knife. It was in Matthew's right hand. Matthew was left-handed, and he had a bullet wound in that same right wrist. 3 people were in that house that night: his wife, her brother, and their mother. And over the following 18 months, investigators would discover that what looked, for one brief moment, like a tragic act of self-defense was something else entirely. A plan that had been discussed, joked about, and finally carried out by the 3 people Matthew Restelli trusted most in the world. This is the story of a man who drove toward what he believed was a reunion with his family, and walked instead into a trap that had been built around him. Stay with me. Matthew Restelli was 42 years old. He was a father. He worked as a handyman, and he lived on a rural property in Aguanga, California, land his own mother had purchased for his family. By every account from his side of the family, he was a man trying to keep his marriage together and bring his children home. His mother, Diane, has described him as someone she spoke with every day, someone whose advice she valued, someone who was simply trying to do his best for his kids. His marriage to Catherine Restelli had been struggling for some time. Catherine later testified that the relationship had been deteriorating, and that she had increasingly confided in her mother, Tracy Grist, and her sister about her problems with Matthew. There had been an incident on a family trip to Disney in 2024 where Catherine and Matthew argued about infidelity. It was reportedly common knowledge within the family that Catherine was afraid of Matthew, and that she described him as having a drinking problem. By June 2024, Catherine had decided to leave Matthew. She rented a vehicle, telling Matthew she was simply visiting family, and drove from their property in California to her mother's home in American Fork, Utah, bringing their 2 young children with her. Tracy Grist, Catherine's mother, was 60 years old. She had been married 4 times. Her son from a previous relationship, Kevin Stanley Ellis, had grown especially close to her, close enough that he had walked his sister Rachel down the aisle at her wedding, taking on something of a fatherly role within the family. What began, by every appearance, as a mother supporting a daughter through marital difficulty would, within a matter of weeks, become something investigators would later describe as one of the most chilling family conspiracies in recent American court history. After about a week of staying with her mother, Catherine testified, "The idea of killing her husband first came up. Said it like a joke." Catherine would later testify, "We can get him to come out here, and we could just murder him and make it look like self-defense. So we originally started more as a joke than a solid plan." It did not stay a joke for long. Deputy Utah County Attorney Adam Pomeroy would later tell jurors that the family joked about the idea so frequently that they became desensitized to it, that the repetition itself dehumanized Matthew, turning a human being into a problem to be solved, rather than a person whose life was actually at stake. Utterly interesting. As the planning continued, Catherine began to have genuine second thoughts. "I had moments where I was thinking that I was going to regret taking somebody else's life," she testified. "I looked in the eyes and said, 'Mom, I don't want to do this anymore.'" Her mother's response was immediate and final. She looked me in the eyes and said, "I don't care, I'm doing it anyway." Catherine would later testify that her mother was the true architect of the plot, and that it was Grist who decided to bring Kevin Ellis into it. She said, "Kevin's feeling suicidal." Catherine recalled her mother saying, "She told him if he was going to do it, go off Matt first, and then he can finish himself off." A son in crisis, a daughter afraid to go back to her marriage, and a mother who, prosecutors would later argue, saw in both of those vulnerabilities an opportunity to solve a family problem with violence. Catherine used Matthew's belief that he was driving to Utah simply to pick up his wife and children and bring them home. Text messages later shown in court made clear that this is genuinely what Matthew thought he was doing. An AirTag was placed on his truck the same day Catherine left for Utah, tracking his location, monitoring his approach. In the days before he arrived, the family made preparations inside the house. Catherine described covering the furniture with blankets, specifically to help with what they anticipated would be blood spatter. Toys were removed from the living room. Cheap blankets were placed over the couch. The magnetic screen door was taken off its frame, making it easier for Matthew to walk straight inside without resistance. 3 to 4 days before the killing, Grist allegedly showed Catherine a knife, wrapped in a glove, hidden in a laundry room basket. She told her daughter she planned to place it in Matthew's hand after the shooting, to make the killing look like self-defense. Everything had been arranged, every detail accounted for. The only thing left was for Matthew to drive through the door. On the night of July 12, 2024, Catherine put her 2 children to bed upstairs, giving them melatonin to help them sleep. Around 9:30 p.m., she went upstairs herself to lie down. When Matthew arrived around 10 p.m., she remained there. She testified that she heard his loud diesel truck pull into the driveway. She heard the doorbell ring, she heard the door open, then she heard the gunshots. Matthew Restelli was shot 7 times. 3 bullets struck his back. Catherine testified that she then heard her mother and brother talking about placing a knife in Matthew's hand, and recalled hearing Kevin say to be careful, because Matthew might still be moving. She shouted down for someone to call 911. Her mother came upstairs and told her Matthew was dead. Catherine told her to call 911 and stayed upstairs until police arrived. It took a full 8 minutes from the moment of the shooting until anyone in that house actually placed the call. The 911 call that finally came in originated not from inside the house at all, but from a neighbor who had heard the shots through a shared wall. When officers responded, Kevin Ellis was the first to speak, telling them, "That guy had a knife." It was a story that fell apart almost immediately. The responding officer testified that he checked Matthew for a pulse and removed a knife from his hand before beginning first aid, and that the knife was gripped in his hand but pointed in the wrong direction for the kind of attack Ellis had described. Matthew was left-handed, and the knife had been placed in his right hand. The bullet wound was also in his right wrist. Later examination revealed pink handwriting on the blade itself, a detail that helped trace the knife back to a purchase made by Tracy Grist months earlier. A neighbor's security camera across the street had captured footage from that night. A vehicle moving through the neighborhood around 10:06 p.m., right as the shots rang out. The story that this had been a sudden act of self-defense against a man who had unexpectedly produced a knife was contradicted by nearly every piece of physical evidence investigators recovered. Before we go any further, I want to pause for a moment. This is a story about a family that turned against one of its own, and what happened after the shooting is, in some ways, just as disturbing as the killing itself. If this story is making you think about trust and family loyalty differently, take a moment and subscribe to Hidden Crime Stories. We bring you cases like this every single week, told carefully and completely. Let's get back to what happened after that 911 call finally went out, because the cover-up this family attempted is almost as elaborate as the murder itself. Tracy Grist gave 2 recorded interviews to police in the hours and days following the shooting. She told officers that they had been expecting Matthew, but maintained that she was startled to find him actually inside the home. She described him as acting different and agitated, though she said he had greeted her warmly before going to speak with Catherine. Then, she said, she heard gunshots. The following day, Grist called Matthew's mother, Diane Restelli, and delivered the news in 2 words: "Matt is dead." When Diane initially assumed her son had died in a car accident, Grist did not correct her. Diane Restelli recorded a phone call with Grist in the days after the killing. On that call, Grist repeatedly claimed she was in shock and did not want to discuss what happened. She said she had attempted to perform life-saving treatment on Matthew. Diane pushed back, asking why Kevin had access to a gun in the first place. The morning after the shooting, Grist texted Catherine directly, instructing her not to tell Diane about anything that happened, warning that it could be used against Kevin. Investigators, meanwhile, were piecing together a digital trail that told a very different story than the one the family was offering. Among the evidence prosecutors introduced were internet searches the family had conducted related to the Donna Adelson case. Adelson was the mother-in-law convicted in the murder-for-hire killing of Florida State law professor Dan Markel, a case that had captured national true crime attention. During the trial, Grist's own search history was shown to include searches for Wendy Adelson photos and "When is Donna Adelson's next hearing?" In closing arguments, the prosecutor would later note something almost darkly fitting about that detail, that Grist herself appeared to have been partly inspired by an interest in true crime stories, and had constructed what he called a poorly executed conspiracy, modeled loosely on a case she had clearly followed closely. Utterly interesting. Police arrested all 3 family members. Matthew Restelli, Matthew's wife and the mother of his children, pleaded guilty to murder and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison, and the judge ordered that she have no contact with her own children, telling her directly, according to court records, that her children were victims of her actions. Ellis and Grist's cases were severed in 2025, with a judge ruling that Ellis would stand trial first. Catherine, who had already pleaded guilty, testified against her own brother at his trial in January 2026, describing, in detail, the plan the 3 of them had built together, and the moment her mother told her there was no turning back. The jury convicted Kevin Ellis of Matthew's murder. They acquitted him, notably, on the specific charge of criminal conspiracy, a split verdict that distinguished his individual act of pulling the trigger from the broader plan his sister and mother had helped construct. On March 31, 2026, Ellis was sentenced to 15 years to life in prison for murder, with additional consecutive sentences for obstruction of justice and other related charges. At sentencing, Matthew's younger brother Jonathan addressed Kevin Ellis directly. "You stole a lifetime of memories from them," he said, referring to Matthew's children. He told the court that the children had learned about their own uncle's involvement in their father's death from other kids at school. Court TV also reported that Ellis told police in a recorded jail call played at his own sentencing, "I should have said no." Tracy Grist's trial followed in April 2026. She testified in her own defense, denying any involvement in a conspiracy and insisting that multiple statements she had made about wanting to kill her son-in-law, captured in texts, recounted by her own children on the witness stand, were simply jokes. In closing arguments, prosecutor Adam Pomeroy described Grist as the hub and mission control of the entire conspiracy. He told jurors that on the night of the killing, her home had been a hive of activity, with Grist at the center of nearly every communication. Kate and her kids were the motive, Kevin was the means, and Tracy was the mastermind, he said. "Without Tracy, this doesn't happen. Without Tracy, Matthew Restelli is alive." Utterly interesting. Pomeroy also pointed to a text Grist had sent in response to her son being angry with her while he sat in jail awaiting trial. Her reply, "I'm mad at me too." Utterly interesting. The jury found Tracy Grist guilty of murder, criminal conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and domestic violence in the presence of a child. A mother, a daughter, a son, all 3, ultimately, held legally responsible for the death of one man who believed, right up until the final moment, that he was simply walking into his mother-in-law's house to bring his wife and children home. Before I share my closing thoughts on this one, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. This case is disturbing for a reason that's a little different from most of what we cover. It's not a stranger, or even a single person's secret double life. It's an entire family talking themselves into something unthinkable, one joke and one rationalization at a time. If this story affected you, let me know in the comments what stayed with you most. And if you think this story deserves to reach more people, please share it. Subscribe to Hidden Crime Stories so you don't miss what's next. Now, here's what I want you to take from this one. I want to start with something the prosecutor said in his closing argument, because I think it's the single most important sentence in this entire case. He said the family joked about killing Matthew so often that it dehumanized him, that the repetition of the idea, even as a joke, slowly stripped away the natural resistance any person should feel toward harming someone they've shared a family with for years. Utterly interesting, that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it explains something about how ordinary people arrive at unthinkable acts that no single dramatic moment ever could. Tracy Grist did not wake up one day and decide to murder her son-in-law. By Catherine's own testimony, the idea started as something closer to dark humor, the kind of venting that unhappy people sometimes do when they feel trapped and powerless. "We could just murder him and make it look like self-defense," said At first, the way people say things they don't actually mean, as a release valve for real pain. But ideas like that don't stay harmless just because they started as jokes. Said often enough, inside a closed family system where everyone reinforces everyone else's worst impulse, a joke becomes a plan. A plan becomes a checklist. A checklist becomes blankets on a couch and a knife wrapped in a glove, and an AirTag tracking a man's truck across state lines. Here is what I want you to take from this story. Pay attention to how your family or your closest circle talks about conflict when things get difficult. Venting is normal. Anger is normal. But there is a meaningful difference between someone saying, "I wish this person were out of my life," in a moment of frustration, and a family that returns to the idea of violence again and again until it stops sounding extreme and starts sounding like a reasonable option. If you notice that shift happening in yourself or in people you love, that is the moment to intervene, long before any plan takes shape. Say something. Get help. Break the cycle of repetition before repetition does what it did inside that house in American Fork. Matthew Restelli told her mother, to her face, that she didn't want to go through with it. She said, "Mom, I don't want to do this anymore." Her mother's answer was simple and final. "I don't care. I'm doing it anyway." That moment, a daughter trying to step back from the edge and a mother refusing to let her, is, to me, the real tragedy underneath this entire case. Not just what was done to Matthew Restelli, devastating as that is, but the fact that someone in that house knew, clearly enough to say it out loud, that this was wrong, and was overruled anyway by the person she trusted most to keep her safe. Matthew Restelli drove toward his family that night because he believed, completely, that he still had one. He was a father trying to bring his children home. He deserved so much more than what was waiting for him on the other side of that door. His children are the ones left to carry the truth of what happened to their father, a truth they reportedly learned in part from other kids at school before anyone in their own family sat down and told them directly. That is its own kind of failure, and it's one worth remembering the next time any of us are tempted to let a dark joke about someone we're angry with go further than it should.